Hi,
Assalamualaikum.
warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
My name is Muhammad
Aidil Shah bin Shahbul Nizam.
Isnu Mukhlisa Aliyah binti Zainal Abidin.
Siti Sarah binti Zaidi.
Muhammad Amin bin Farid
Hafiz Rahimi bin Muhammad Hilmi.
From class IC
120
4B1.
Before we going to elaborate about the evolution of faith, we must to know about the faith and Sharia first. The principle of faith has existed since the beginning of faith. As long as there is faith, it is certain of usul, dawabit, and rules will exist. The writing of faith, on the other hand, is regarded or more advanced and earlier than the writing of faith proposal. However, this does not imply that it does not exist until it is written. Okay. Meanwhile, Sharia, according to Tafsir Al-Qurtubi, in terms of terminology, Sharia means any rules or ruling revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which consists of the law in the Quran and Sunnah, which are related of the field of Aqidah and act of mukallaf, whether law hakam qat'i or zamni, is also interpreted as a regulation, teaching, or manhaj by some scholar. Okay, the word Sharia and those that must be mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 48, which is Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, wa anzalna ilaikal kitab bil haqq musaddiqan lima bayna yaday minal kitabin wa muhaiminan alaih fahkum bainahum bima anzalallah wa la tattabi' ahwa'ahum amma ja'aka minal haqq likulli ja'alna minkum syir'atan wa minhaja. Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 48.
Okay, on this slide, I will tell about the first revolution of fiqh, which is the first stage is the stage of foundation. It began at the era of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The first stage in the development of fiqh covers the era of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is at 609 until 632 century. As we all know, during that time, the only source of Islamic law that were used by our Prophet Muhammad for the reference is Al-Quran and As-Sunnah. And besides, it followed by the law in Mecca and also law in Medina. As been informed, the nature of revealed law in Mecca was very different than the nature of revealed law in Medina. As you can see, the nature of revelation changed after the migration from Mecca to Medina. Okay, on this slide, I will tell more details about two sources or method of legislation, which is we have Al-Quran and As-Sunnah. As we all know, Al-Quran represented the blueprint in his day-to-day life. As we all know, Quran is the holy book for Muslim. According to Islamic teaching, the Quran is a revelation that Allah revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam through Jibril, who has reached the age now mutawatir. About the revealed Quran has a close connection with Laylatul Qadar. The Quran was revealed to Prophet Muhammad gradually in 22 years. Besides, we also have As-Sunnah. As-Sunnah acts as a detailed explanation of the general principles outlined in the Quran, as well as practical demonstration of their application. As we all know, Quran and Sunnah is a connection between both. Which is, for example, if some problem or some issue that we don't see, we don't find in the Quran, we can refer from hadith or a sunnah, which is can be a reference in order to get the results or the solution for that problem. I will also tell about the nature of revealed law. We have two period, which is Makkah period and Madinah period. We go at Makkah period first, which is the first 13 years of Prophet Muhammad's revelation focused primarily on what is known as Usuluddin, principles of religion. For example, justice, fairness, gratitude, honesty, and others. And Mecca, as we all know, Mecca law focus on building the individual in terms of faith and character, which is during that period, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam focus on building the strong belief or faith in order to keep the akidah strong and maintained. Also, besides after the migration, which is on the Madinah period, Madani revelation focused heavily on detailed legal ruling of human action. As you can see, the regarding acts of worship such as prayer, zakat, fasting, and others, which is on that period, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam focused on fiqh, which is most of the Muslims have already learned about fasting, praying, and others. On this slide, I will tell about the basics of legislation in the Quran, which is first, the removal of difficulty, second, the reduction of religious obligation, third, realization of public welfare, and last but not least, the realization of universal justice. As we all know, the removal of difficulty in the other words is a rukhsah, which is, for example, if we, musafir or we have a long journey, we can shorten our time, our prayer, such as Zohor 4 to 2 and Isha 4 to 2 also. Besides, as you can see in Surah Al-Baqarah on 185, A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yuridullahu bikumul yusra wa la yuridu bikumul usra, meaning Allah wish for you ease and He does not wish difficulty for you. As you can see, it this word from Quran shown that Islam is a not hard religion. Second, the relation of legal obligation, which is it help the mankind. Number of consequences of the favor principle is the total number of legal obligation should be relative few. This principle can be clearly seen in the method by which the Quran deals with prohibition and permission. Third, the realization of public welfare. As you can see, as we all know, that because the laws of Islam were primarily exercised to the general enacted for the general good of all mankind. For example, our Prophet once says that I had forbidden you from visiting the graveyard. However, permission has been given to me to visit the grave of my mother. So visit them, for there to remind one of you next life. As you can see, the explanation of the reasons for loss indicates that the presence of absences of loss depends on the assistance of the non-assistance of their cause. It's the benefit for which the law was enacted continues. And last but not least, the realization of universal justice. As we all know, Allah once said in the Holy Quran, Surah An-Nahl 90, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan, meaning Allah has enjoined justice and righteousness. As you can see, Islam consider all humans the same with regard to their obligation to submit to the divine laws and in their responsibility for breaking them. As Muslim, we must always do all commands and leave the prohibition. This is because Allah loves His servants that always doing good things.
So, the era of the righteous caliphs and the great Sahaba, companions of the Prophet, is represented by this stage. During the first 2 decades of this period, the Islamic State swiftly expanded to include Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and Persia. As a result, Muslims were abruptly exposed to completely different institution and culture for which the Sharia made no specific accommodation. The righteous caliphs depend instantly on consensus decision as well as ijtihad which they had been trained in by the Prophet Muhammad to deal with the myriad new difficulties. So then fiqh, as a result of their intensive use of ijma and ijtihad, this established produce that ultimately became the basis for legislation in Islam is fiqh, as a result of the intensive use of ijma and ijtihad. Right. So this is the righteous caliph's problem solving technique. A new issues has arisen. The following steps were generally taken in order to solve problems. First, he would look in the Quran for a particular decision on the issue. If he couldn't find the answer in Quran, he had looked in the Sunnah for a ruling on the subject. Then, if he still could not discover an explanation, he had convened a gathering of the main Sahaba and tried to reach a consensus. If unanimity could not be reached, he would take the majority stance. If, on the other hand, the disagreement was severe enough that an overwhelming majority opinion could be ascertained, the caliph would issue his own ijtihad, which would then become law. It is also worth mentioning that the caliph had the authority to ignore the consensus. So the approach of individual Sahabah to ijtihad, it is the three general courses of action. At first, thus imposition of decision making made it plain that their deduction were not always in line with Allah's will. When asked about the inheritance right of a lady who had married without a state mahram, dowry, Ibn Mas'ud said, I am providing my opinion on her. If it is correct, it came from Allah. If this is erroneous, it came from me. And second, if the reach opposite conclusion on an issue is in their respective capacities and were later notified of an authentic, it is a hadith, speech or action by the Prophet on the subject, they will promptly accept it and put their difference aside. Finally, when neither authentic proof nor unanimity could be found, the Prophet Muhammad companions used to accept each other's ideas and would not force other Sahaba to follow any one of them. The only exception to this rule was if they discover people engaging in acts that had previously been permissibly but had since become illegal. For example, by the time of the Prophet, that's mut'ah, a pre-Islamic kind of temporary marriage that had been permitted in the early stage of Islam, had been outlawed. During Abu Bakr Caliph and the first half of Umar, so some of the Sahabah were unaware of the restriction and continued to practice temporary. It is a temporary marriage. When Umar learned of mut'ah, he outlawed it and imposed a heavy punishment on anybody who practiced it. Right. So we move to the factionalism is not present. Although the Sahaba debate on various points, their difference rarely reached the level of disunity, which characterized later periods. First, the Caliph's reliance on mutual consultation to arrive at a ruling. Second, the ease which a consensus could be arrived at. Third, the general reluctance of individual Sahaba to make legal rulings, which is fatwas. Instead, they tend to redirect puzzling questions to others. And fourth, the infrequent quotation of hadith, which they tend to read confined to specific and actual problem. It is divided to two. First, their fear of misquoting the Prophet ﷺ, who has said, whoever tells a lie in my name will find his seat in the fire. And second, the fact that Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab forbade excessive quotation of hadith and ordered the Sahaba to concentrate on the narration, the study of the Quran. So we move on to the characteristic of fiqh during this period. So first is realism, it was based on actual problem rather than on hypothetical or imaginary ones. Second, freedom of opinion. The Sahaba didn't prescribe set producers to be followed, nor did they make a record of the law resulting from their legal rulings. This open-mindedness reflects the Sahaba's respect for freedom of opinion and was in keeping with the Sahaba policy of recommending for the masses the careful study of the Quran without the distraction of legal rulings on matter not defined therein. And third, limited use of personal opinion in making legal rulings. The majority of the Sahaba prefer to stick closely to the literal meaning of texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. As a general practice, they avoid giving personal interpretation. On the other hand, there were other Sahaba who favored the wide use of personal opinion in areas undefined by either the Quran or Sunnah. However, they were careful to attribute resulting errors entirely to themselves. And fourth, modification of some law. Modification of some law owing to one or another of two factors: the disappearance of the result of the reason for the law's existence, or a change in a social conditions. An example of the first is the prohibition by Caliph Umar of the practice of giving cash gifts to newly converted Muslims and thus learning towards Islam. The second factor prompted a change in the divorce law. Owing to the tremendous influx of wealth, marriage became easier and consequently divorce became alarmingly frequent. To discourage abuse of divorce, Umar declared that multiple divorce pronouncements will be binding and therefore irreversible. And fifth, the madhhab. During the period of the righteous caliphs was unifying and directly linked to the stage as in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The madhhab was that of the caliph himself, since the caliph in each case had the final say in all legal decisions involving ijtihad or ijma. However, when the succeeding caliphs came to power, his madhab would then be given precedence over that of his predecessor, and the ruling of his predecessors would be changed to conform to his opinion.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. In this part, I want to tell you about stage building in Dynasty Umayyah. This stage covered the rise and fall of the Umayyah dynasty. The Umayyah were in power for approximately 1 century, extending from the death of the last of the righteous Caliph Ali bin Abi Talib in 661 century, and the excedency of the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, Caliph Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, until the last of the Umayyad Caliph around the middle of the 8th century. The period was marked by great social unrest. The Ummah divided into various sects and factions. The Caliphate was converted into a kingship. Many new practices were introduced, some of which were haram. The scholar refused to sit in the audience of the Caliph, and in the facts fled to outlying areas to avoid conflict and confusion. For the first factor is division of Ummah. Within the first quarter of century of this period, the Muslim nation suffered a number of devastating socio-political blows which caused a number of sects and factions to appear. The most serious were those caused by rebellions of Khawarij, the Shia, and Abdullah ibn az-Zubayr and his followers. The constant vying of this contending element for control of the government result in a general state of turmoil. The first two factions, the Khawarij and the Shia, later evolved into religious sects which developed their own particular system of fiqh, relying on unorthodox interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, which suit their own socio-political views. They rejected the contribution of most of Sahabat and the righteous Caliph, declaring them to be apostates and elevated their own leading figures to the rank of lawmakers. Okay, for the second factor is the division of the Umayyad Caliph. The Umayyad Caliph introduced a number of practices which were common in the non-Islamic states of that time, such as Byzantium, Persia, and India. Many of these practices were in clear contradiction to the fiqh of the early period. For example, the central treasury, the Baitul Mal, was turned into the personal property of the Caliph, and their families and tax not sanctioned by Islam were introduced to further increase their fortunes. Music, dancingers, magicians, and astrologers were officially introduced as a form of amusement in the court of the Caliph. Furthermore, with the forced acceptance of Yazid as a crown prince imposed by Caliph Muawiyah in the year 679 century at the time, the office of Caliph was converted into that of hereditary kingship. Hence, the state fiqh link was broken, and significant unifying factor of the mazhab was thereby lost. Due to this factor, the Islamic scholar ulama of this period avoided sitting in the audience of the Caliph, and thus the principles of shura was lost. With each successive Caliph, the government steadily deteriorated into a dictatorial monarchy similar to the non-Islamic government of that day. As a result, some of the Caliph attempted to manipulate fiqh in order to justify their division. To combat this distortion and preserve authentic fiqh for later generation, scholars begin to collect and compile the fiqh of the early period. Next, the third of the factor is the dispersion of ulama. Many of the scholars of that time filled the political centers of the Umayyad state to avoid conflict and confusion, as well as persecution from the various competing factions. This move resulted in a breakdown of the principle of ijma. With the scholars scattered through the state, such anonymity on any new point of law become virtually impossible to establish. This in turn lead to the significant increase in the individual ijtihad of scholars as they attempt to deal with the multiplicity of new custom and problems in their own areas. Whenever an outstanding scholar of the fiqh rose in the area, the student and scholar in that region would gather around him. Often, every student and scholar from other regions would join them, and in that way, a number of schools of Islamic law, mazhab, involved during this stage. Abu Hanifa and Sufyan At-Tawri become prominent in Kufa, Malik ibn Anas in Madinah, Al-Awza in Beirut, and Al-Layth ibn Asad in Egypt, to mention a few. And the lastly factor is the fabrication of hadith. The narration of hadith increased as the needs for information grew, since the state had unfortunately stopped relying on the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Scholars in their various capacities had to go in search of individual narration of the sunnah handed down by Sahabat and their students in order to make their legal judgment. At the same time, a new phenomena developed. False saying and action began to be attributed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for the first time. For a fabricator to be trusted, he would have to relay some truth hadith along with his fabrication. This led to the beginning of the compilation of the hadith and the development of the science of hadith criticism, which aided later scholars in their ijtihad, which mean legal rulings. However, before the science of hadith involved, a mixture of true and false report work their ways into the body of Islamic knowledge and was inadvertently used by some scholar in making decision. In this way, a body of incorrect fiqh involved, which was further bolstered by fiqh decision made by scholars who had rejected certain true hadith because they were only known to them through the hadith fabricators of their areas.
Characteristic of fiqh in Umayyad period. Scholars and students of the Islamic Empire during this period tended to split into two main groups, which are Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Ra'i. Ahlul Hadith avoid making legal ruling on an issue if clearly defined texts from Hadith and Quran related to the issue were not available, while Ahlul Ra'i use of deductive reasoning and ijtihad more than Ahlul Hadith. And Ahlul Hadith scholars was in Hijaz, Madinah, while Ahlul Ra'i scholars was in Kufah, Iraq. Reason for differences. The capital of the Islamic State was shifted to Iraq, so there's different social cultural background, and that's make the differences happen. Ahlul Hadith also got many hadiths and legal ruling made by the first three caliphs, which are before Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib. So they already know the solution and the legal ruling, while Ahlul Ra'i has only small number of companions settled in Iraq. So there's many new problem arises, and it's out of experience of Muslim scholars at that time, and this lead to many fabricated hadith appeared. So the scholars can't rely on hadith alone because there's so many fabricated hadiths. They rely on more on reason and logic. They rely on ijtihad more than hadith at that time. compilation of fiqh. During the period of four righteous caliphs, there was no compilation of the fatwas at all. So during the Umayyad period, that the first attempt to compile legal ruling. What happened? Because with the change of the governmental structure from the caliphate to the monarchy during this period, the decisions were increasingly taken that were contrary to the Sahabah decision. So who had studied under the Sahabah in the very center of Islamic learning realized that if a concerted effort were not made to preserve the earlier ruling, later generation of Muslims will not be able to get the benefit from the contributions of the Sahaba. As a result, the early Hijaz scholars gathered the various fatwas of Abdullah ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Umar, and Aisha binti Abi Bakr. While in Iraq also do the same, their scholars gathered the decision of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ali bin Abi Talib. But unfortunately, neither of these first collections survived in their original form. They are now only known by references made to them in the books of the next generation scholars. However, many of the rulings contained in the original collection have been preserved by a way of narration in the books of hadith and history book, as well as in later
Of
books
the
of fiqh.
preceding this chapter, we have seen the evolution of faith has going through in three basic stage, which are foundation, establishment, and building. When the state was a single body, the leadership was unified and orthodox, and Muslim scholars were close to each other, thereby facilitating communication. Based on said Faraz Hassan, this study argued that Islamic law and tradition have the capability and the resources to accommodate social change. This adaptation has been achieved by passing through a complex process in interpretation, negotiation, and intellectualism. The progress of Muslim legal tradition in terms of establishing competing juridical school, producing voluminous work throughout the countries, and recognizing the legitimacy of differences of opinion in judicial matter attends to this conclusion. There is no mazhab is given preference over another in education institution. Islamic law could then be studied from the primary sources, and the position of various mazhab could then be analyzed rationally and objectively as outlined previously. That's all from us. Thank you.